Today I've got a challenge for you if you make any type of dance music. What I want you to do is, instead of programming a whole bunch of elements on your timeline and then trying to get them all to play well together, I want you to strip it down into this minimalist approach. I want you to use simply one drum rack device and consider that that's going to be your Groovebox that carries all of the drums for your track, even if you're doing percussive techno. You've probably all heard about constraints being like the trigger for creativity. Well, this isn't just a random constraint. This is a very well thought out and motivated constraint that might actually unlock something, especially if the percussion in your tracks lack focus and direction. Think of it like this. Imagine Jeff Mills. Jeff Mills would use his 909 Groovebox as the heart and center of everything that he does. So if you take away every other musical element, he can make an entire dance track with just the raw elements from his Groovebox. So that means muting and unmuting different elements, but each of those elements inside the Groovebox is chosen specifically to fill a certain function. For example, the kick is the driving, pounding, low energy. The hi-hat is the crisp, upwards pulling energy that bounces off the low energy of the kick. The ride cymbal is a splashy world of highs up above. You've got some toms in the mids and the lows, and some mid percussion like claps and rims to spice up the mids and to make a rhythmic cell that really keeps the mid energy grooving. None of these elements are random, and so designing the core elements of a Groovebox is like designing an entire track. Everything has its own place, everything has its own function. And if I tell you that you can have maximum 12 elements, what 12 elements are you going to design and why? Everyone's answer to this might look a little different. The inspiration for this challenge for me came from looking at the analog rhythm. I'm going to be using it for the live set, and so I'm like, okay, I want this thing to be a Groovebox. I want this thing in itself to have all the elements that you need to keep things driving, just like as if you had a 909 drum machine that you have access to all the kicks and highs and blistering mids that you need. And then I was like, let me go into Ableton and design the elements that I then want to load into each of these drum triggers. And the analog rhythm has 12. So 1, 2, 3, 4 by 1, 2, 3. So 12 elements, no more, no less. And so to think that through, I would go into Ableton, create a new MIDI track, stick a drum rack on there. And in this empty drum rack, I only have the right to 12 samplers, nothing else. And then I'd have to think through, okay, well, what do I really want? What do I want each pad to have? Are there very clear functional elements that I would always want to be sort of in the same place? And the answer is yes. So for me, I'm going to want a kick always in the same place. I'm going to want a clap always in the same place. I'm going to want a hi-hat that's closed in the same place, and a hi-hat that's open also in the same place. So that if I just solo the kick, the clap, and the hi-hat, I can get a boom, kicks, whenever I want. Then for my musical universe, I definitely want a shaker. That's a hi-hat that's going every 16th note, more or less. And a ride, so that when I turn on the ride, I get a big, splashy high end. You'll notice that I've got 4 high-end elements. So those are my 4 gears that I can go to in the high end. And I currently only have the kick in the lows. So what else would I want in the lows? Well, I want to give myself 2 low options. Low 1 and low 2. If this was a kit modeled after the 909, this would be, for example, the low and the mid tom, or 2 times a low tom. But in my case, it can be maybe a kind of a rumble or a little low bass sound, or something to create syncopation alongside the kick. And that leaves me with 1, 2, 3, 4 empty pads, and I can now use my fantasy. I've got all my functional elements kind of nailed down, and I can ask myself the question, what else do I want to have happening in the mids? And so I'm just going to call this lead 1, lead 2, lead 3, and lead 4. And if I can come up with interesting sounds for each of these elements, and I can mute and unmute them in various combinations, and it kind of sounds cool, even when it's quite dense, then I know I'm very close to a drum section that's really going to be able to be the basis for a track. While I'm going to be doing all of this percussive design, by the way, I might want to have something nice in the mids so that the drums have something to be accompanied by. So for example, I made this kind of pattern that's a little bit inspired by an acid sequence, but fed into like a very soft bell sound. So it's a bit of a polymeter, it's a bit shimmery, it's a bit nice. And then I would add in one of my drum tracks, and let me show you one that I've done a few days ago. Notice here I don't have them all unmuted. So if you just hear the drum rack, just the kick. Obviously on the kick sample I've done a lot of sound design so that it is a whole world in itself. A low tom, another low tom. So the lows are doing this plus the kick. And then when you wonder, okay, how does this sound with a more lead synth element in the mids, you can then add something like this. Or some more abstract modular synthesizer sounds. That also works. Or with a ripping acid line. I love it. Now here's another example of that. So, a different vibe altogether of the elements. Love it. Let's put back on the bells. That's a vibe. That's a vibe. Yeah, this is pretty well designed. And we take away the kick to see what it would feel like in the break. And back. Dope. Obviously the idea in a real track would be that there's more elements playing than just this Groovebox, right? But this Groovebox needs to be the solid foundation of what I'm doing, especially in percussive techno. Here's a different approach. Much less rumbly. Very clean. Maybe a little bit more UK garage inspired in its clean, bouncy sounds. Sweet. And in this one, I did the same approach with the idea of making a very 909 sort of style everything. And again, you put in some mids for context, and you're like, this is going to be awesome. So I guess what this really teaches us is that your whole track can kind of live inside of a Groovebox, and before you start creating infinite amount of elements, maybe see if you can strip it down to just a Groovebox approach, 12 elements, and have a motivation in your mind of why you choose those elements. I would suggest thinking in terms of what's going on in the low end, what's going on in the high end, and what's going on in the mids. I would suggest muting and unmuting various layers, and don't be afraid to go really deep on sound design and mixing even inside of the rack, because if your rack can sound like a fully published song already in terms of sound quality, that's a huge win, because then all you have to do is mute and unmute elements, and making a dance music arrangement is going to be so easy and straightforward because you just need to cut and paste different patterns because you know that the raw sounds in your Groovebox are already absolutely banging. When you're learning music production, the amount of options that you have are so overwhelmingly large that this stripping it down to a Groovebox approach hopefully adds some simplicity and clarity to your design process and simplifies the amount of choices that you have to make so that pretty soon you can get out of your head and into your feelings and just enjoy the process. Because that's when you're making music, ultimately the goal is to stay in your feelings and not be so much in your head. But in the DAW, the amount of options can be so fatiguing. So I hope this helped. If you like learning from me, go check out one of my courses. And until next time, stay producing, be good to each other, and take care. Bye-bye.